Hi, today I'm going to talk about rage, specifically during singles brackets. I'm decided to make a video about this because I've raged a lot, I've made angry tweets, discredited my opponents, thrown controllers, and launched through and broke my phone. While I have worked on this for myself, I also think it's really important to develop an actual understanding of one's issues, so then the efforts to change for the better can be more purposeful and direct, which then leads to actual results. In this video, I'm going to look into the Smash community's view of rage, the psychological factors that create it, how the community creates environments for rage to foster, and potential ways for us all to move forward. So I recently made a survey asking people about their feelings and attitudes about rage. While this isn't necessarily like a deeper understanding of what rage is or how it functions, it's also really important on a very social level to understand what rage does to other people. So the most common feeling when someone rages is awkwardness and discomfort. And it's also worth noting that the least common response was indifference. So when someone rages, most people feel it. The other most common responses were concern for equipment and feeling bad for the winner. Also, people are more likely to feel embarrassed and laugh at the person raging than feel bad for them. So this coincides with the finding that an overwhelming majority of people view rage as something that can be worked on. If not, I think more people would see it as a negative thing that happens to the loser and feel bad instead of laugh at them. Not only do people feel negatively about rage, they also think of it as negative. People are much more likely to list it as embarrassing or detrimental to the rager than they were to think of it as a healthy part of competition or just venting. Because of all of this, the community views rage not only as something that can be worked on, but should be. While I think this is all really interesting, and like I said, I think it's good to know how people feel about rage so you understand what you're doing when you rage, it also leaves a lot of questions unanswered. For example, one of the most common responses is that rage is detrimental for the person who does it. But is that true? Also, why do we rage in the first place? The research I did on this subject has really changed the way that I view rage, and I also think it could help a lot of people who still do it and don't understand why. Now, I wasn't able to find research on video game rage specifically, so instead I looked at aggressiveness and self-esteem. A 1996 literature review on the interaction found that when aggressiveness and self-esteem interacted, it was due to threatened high self-esteem. Threatened means a person receives feedback that is less favorable than they would expect. A Smash example might be a ranked player who rages after getting upset by someone that's unranked. This is called an ego threat as it threatens one's self-esteem. The authors also state that after an ego threat, those with high self-esteem frequently respond in ways that are drastic and irrational. For example, in Smash, throwing your controller is pretty common. It doesn't help the rager in any way, which makes it irrational, and I also think it's fair to say it's drastic. Following this literature, it would seem that players who rage believe in their skill, but only until they lose unexpectedly. The authors also theorize that anger is used as a way to ignore other negative feelings that occur after an ego threat. So instead of actually considering the possibility that one might not be as good as they think, they get angry and aggressive at the source of criticism. In this view, rage then would not be the immediate direct emotional reaction from what happens in the game. Instead, what happens in a set forces people with high self-esteem to consider whether or not they are truly skilled, and instead of dealing with those questions, they get angry and aggressive. This could be what leads to things such as thrown controllers and screaming after a set. Personally, after reading this, I could think of a lot of instances my rage was pretty forced. There would be sets I knew I was going to lose before it ended, and I still decided to do something stupid like throw my controller or hit the table. For me, rage was very rarely a reflection of how I actually felt, and instead it was a coping mechanism that I chose to deal with my feelings. To see whether my experience was shared in the Smash community, I watched two Salt compilations, the Saltiest Smash Ultimate Moments of 2019 and Super Smash Bros. Melee Salt compilations 1 through 6, both about 35 minutes long. In every clip, I looked at whether or not the rage came after the last game of the set or after each opponent was on their last stock of the game. This was to determine if the rage for these players was truly an immediate reaction to a disappointing outcome, or if rage could be seen as planned or forced. About 57% of the clips were after sets that did not go to the last game, and 48% were after games that were not last stocked. Roughly 70% of the clips were either not last game or last stock, meaning only about 30% were truly last hit sets. Now, granted, only 33% were neither last game nor last stock, and it could be argued that just one of these factors would be enough to make someone rage because it would still be surprising within that game. However, people usually don't rage after a close game won. People rage after they lose a set. So I think it's fair to look at the proportions of sets that weren't truly last hit as indicative of whether or not rage was somehow forced in these situations. This is not to say all forms of rage and assault are a way to mask insecurity after a blow to self-esteem. However, when the same player rages over and over again in different situations, or when someone rages after getting 3-0'd in a 3-stock, the issue is not surprise. The two SALT compilations seem to confirm that frequently rage is more of a coping mechanism than just a feeling. Now, some of you might be thinking, is confidence really all that bad? Even if in some people it can occasionally lead to rage, isn't having high self-esteem a good thing overall? Now, to be completely honest, I wasn't being completely honest about the relationship between violence and self-esteem. Further research has shown that high self-esteem can be thought in two separate ways, secure and defensive. Secure people view their worth as innate, accepting themselves completely, including their flaws. Defensive people are more likely to base their worth off their accomplishments, so when they fail, it is devastating. However, this does not mean that only defensive people feel upset after a performance. Both types of high self-esteem will experience negative feelings after a loss. However, secure people view failures as domain-specific, whereas defensive people view it as indicative of their overall worth. For example, after a bad tournament, someone that's secure might view the result as reflecting specific deficiencies that can be improved on, view skill at Smash Bros as unimportant to them, or just recognize they're not that good. Someone who's defensive might view it as a personal failing, indicative of their potential, and feel terrible as a result. Under this framework, rage would typically originate from defensive individuals. Now, just a quick note, whenever I say defensiveness and secure, from now on, I'm referring to people with secure or defensive high self-esteem. I'm not talking about people with low self-esteem in this video at all. Recent research has shed more light onto the factors that lead to defensiveness versus secureness. One study has shown secure individuals are more likely to have explicit and implicit high self-esteem. That is, they consciously and unconsciously feel valued. Defensive people recognize their worth consciously, but unconsciously they doubt it. Now, if you're wondering how this happens, one thing is that people will recognize their external achievements. So if you get ranked on a PR, you're like, oh, I'm obviously good, I'm ranked. But then you don't address the doubts that kind of come up unconsciously, and that leaves this disconnect between your explicit high self-esteem and your implicit high self-esteem. So this is in part what can lead to aggressive responses after their self-esteem is threatened. Defensive people are defending themselves from their own perceptions. Also, defensive people show more self-presentation bias, making themselves look better than they actually are. It's suggested that to have high self-presentation bias, one has to deny common human weaknesses. This fits in well with the previous literature suggesting anger is used to mask insecurity. The root of defensiveness that leads to rage requires viewing oneself as better than one can possibly be, as well as denying any feelings of doubt. Now, not only can one be confident without being susceptible to rage, it is likely that doing so will be more conducive to one's growth. A paper examining how people maintain their self-esteem set up experiments where one group of people was exposed to a growth mindset and the other a fixed one. Participants were assigned to complete a test and then given phony results. They were told they failed regardless of how they actually did. Those in the growth condition showed growth-oriented strategies. They compared upwards to learn what better performers did and reviewed tutorials on materials they supposedly failed. In the fixed condition, participants maintain their self-esteem with defensive strategies, comparing downwards to make themselves feel better than those who had performed worse, and reviewing material they already had mastered. While the study doesn't isolate defensive self-esteem as the root cause, it shows that defensive strategies at maintaining self-esteem run counter to learning and growth. Another way defensiveness hinders growth has to do with what happens after they rage. Post-ego threat, defensive individuals respond by raising their expectations and aspirations instead of lowering them. This creates a cycle of disappointment, where people perform under their expectations, get angry, then raise their goals an unreasonable amount, which leads to further disappointment and failure. This cycle then repeats itself with the latest failure, leading to even higher aspirations, leading to even more insecurity, which creates more rage, followed by raising their expectations again. One of the most obvious examples of this in Smash is when you have an unranked or low-ranked player attend a major and there's a PGR player in their pool. Very frequently, these players make it their goal to beat the PGR level player instead of just focus on making it out or try to beat the other ranked players in the pool. So then they put all their time into practicing the PGR matchup and studying their VODs instead of working on things that are accomplishable. Taken all together, rage can be seen as coming from ego threats, a coping mechanism, the result of an insecure ego, cyclical, and preventing growth. However, there's more to rage than just individual psychological factors. In the literature review about self-esteem and violence, the authors noted that there were some cultures with zero-sum self-esteem, such as gang culture. What this means is that self-esteem has a set total. For one person to increase their self-esteem, another person has to lose some. This happens because these cultures are very hierarchical. Their worth is based on social positioning. If one person reaches a higher social status, that means someone else will have a lower social status. People in these cultures then are forced to defend their status. This is seen as leading to defensive high self-esteem and then aggression and violence. The Smash community can be considered extremely hierarchical, especially regarding skill. Almost every single region I know, even sub-regions that are a part of a bigger scene, have power rankings. When a new player rises through the rankings, other players have to fall. The rankings themselves are generally seen as an indicator of skill, or at the very least an accomplishment. In this way, rankings can create defensiveness. Also, because the rankings tend to be heavily based on data, players seem especially aware of the impact of a good or bad loss. Keeping track of one's results is a good way to keep track of one's ranking, which then is frequently used as a substitute for skill. Because of this, as the season comes to an end, rage appears to be more frequent. Now, this isn't confirmed by any data, it's more of a personal observation. Completely ignoring results isn't good either. If you go 2-2 in your locals, then you're not PGR level. However, I think the emphasis on rankings and data can overemphasize individual results. If you get upset, not only is it disappointing, but it will look bad for your rank. Since rank and skill are seen as interchangeable, getting upset can make someone doubt their skill. Altogether, this breeds insecurity and defensiveness. So now that our understanding of rage is deepened, what can we do about it? On an individual level, I think we need to recognize salt for what it is. Disappointment or frustration is normal and healthy, whereas rage isn't. In addition, we need to be okay with insecurity, specifically when it comes to our own skill level. People believe that being at a skill level means never losing to players below you and sometimes beating players above you. Ignoring the obvious contradiction, we need to recognize that skill is much more nuanced than just a ranking. There are a lot of factors in skill: matchup experience, ability to deal with different playstyles, juggling, landing, etc. Acknowledging the real reasons you lost is important, as you can find ways to improve from it. I also think it's important to recognize results as dynamic. We all have peaks, valleys, and our average, and we tend to focus on always playing at our peak, but it's better to try to move your average up. Focusing too much on one single bracket or one set even is too narrow of a view to accurately describe skill. Similarly, I think it's important to not compare yourself to other people on a similar tier of skill. A lot of players are too close in skill for an accurate distinction between them to be made. And with that in mind, I think it's important to think of one's skill in terms of tiers. Change within a tier doesn't really matter, but improving from one tier to the next does. I also think it's important to recognize what you want out of Smash. For me, making the PR the first time was a big deal, and to be honest, after I made it, it was hard to try as hard as I usually did. I still went to stuff though, and I had high expectations for myself, and that conflict between my level of expectations for my skill and me being content with what I already had created disappointing results and then subsequently rage. So now, how can we change our scenes to deal with rage better? I think the first place to look is our ranking systems. Other fighting game communities don't have power rankings, and I don't think Smash needs them either. That being said, I've had this conversation a lot where I've argued to get rid of PRs, and it's never worked out, so I don't think it's a realistic expectation. However, I do think we could try to make more rankings tiered. No numbered rankings, instead, a group of players is given a tier for their skill level. For example, Northeast Ohio's PR does this. While defensiveness can still grow from this accomplishment, it would put way less of an emphasis on an individual tournament. Losing to someone in the same tier is not as bad as losing to someone who's ranked 2 or 3 spots below you. Also, I think data-driven systems should withhold info until the season ends. In Michigan, for example, the spreadsheet is available throughout the entire season. Now, I totally respect the time and energy put into this spreadsheet, but I don't think it's helpful. For me, after getting a couple decent wins early in the season, I'd resort to checking the spreadsheet constantly to see if I was still keeping up with the PR, and then my results would dip because I wasn't focused on my play. I also viewed bracket as a failure if I didn't get at least one notable win for the spreadsheet. I don't think my experience is isolated either. I've noticed similar things from my friends. Lastly, as a community, I think we need to find ways to promote good sportsmanship. Sportsmanship is much less of a zero-sum endeavor, as everyone can have good sportsmanship. This is harder to execute as there aren't many clear ways to value it as bracket values skill, but I also think it's up to each individual scene to kind of find out something that works for them. For a long time, I had difficulty seeing my rage as an issue. Even though I broke my phone and ended up miserable in most events I attended, I always kind of believed that venting my frustrations would help in some way. It took me so long to realize that I was wrong. Looking back on it now, all I feel is embarrassed and a sense of lost time. The only thing that I can do is move on for myself and try to help other people who are going through the same thing so that they don't have as much time to look back on and regret. Thank you for watching.